Good afternoon. On behalf of the Institute of the Americas, I am pleased to have you join us for this panel on the role of direct foreign assistance, philanthropy, and impact investing in catalyzing community development, economic opportunity, and social enterprise in the Northern Triangle region. While the Biden administration has committed over $4 billion in direct foreign assistance to the Northern Triangle region over the next 4 years, we know that that will not be enough. To truly move the needle, more investment will be needed from not just US government, but also direct foreign assistance from other nations, support from other multilateral development agencies, as well as philanthropy and social impact investors. As I say, it's going to take a village. Also, it's been pretty clear that to stem the tide of outbound migration, foreign assistance needs to reach the people and the communities that need it most. The question is how to do that. Besides direct funding to help tackle the challenges across the Northern Triangle region in the areas of income inequality, poverty, lack of access to healthcare and education, there's a critical need to catalyze new small business enterprises and to help young people find employment opportunities in their own communities. Here, opportunities are emerging for Central America in the areas of impact investment through green and social bonds, and we'll hear more about that in a bit. These new vehicles are drawing impact investors seeking to align their investment goals and objectives with social impact that have had success in other parts of the world, including elsewhere in Latin America. As a former president and CEO of the International Community Foundation, I've spent time in the Northern Triangle region as a grant maker and know from my own personal experience that the work is not easy. It's often difficult to measure impacts in a short period of time, and sometimes that's the expectation that some donors have. Here, from a philanthropic organization or an impact investor, the questions are similar. Where to prioritize? How can we achieve the highest social impact? So today we have 4 distinguished panelists covering a range of experiences in the fields of philanthropy and impact investment. Let me share a little about their backgrounds. First, our first speaker is Paloma Adams-Allen. She's the president and CEO of the Inter-American Foundation based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the IAF, she led the global private sector partnership initiatives for the Winrock International, an international NGO. Before that, she served as the deputy assistant administrator at USAID with a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. And in her role, she placed close to $1 billion of outgoing social and economic programs in over 28 Latin American countries. Paloma has also spent time working at the OAS on policy, programming, and leadership roles to advance integral development in the Americas. Paloma is a graduate of Brown University, where she got her BA in Development Studies. She got a master's from Johns Hopkins School of International Affairs, SAIS, and she also has a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Caroline Kronley is the president of the Tinker Foundation based in New York City, where she promotes development in Latin America with a focus on governance, education, and the environment. Previous to her role in Tinker, she worked as the managing director for strategy at the Rockefeller Foundation, leading the development of new programmatic initiatives. Caroline also has work in Mexico. She's worked in Mexico focusing on strategic planning activities related to micro finance institutions. Caroline has a BA in history from Haverford College and with a concentration in Latin American studies, and she has an MBA from the Yale School of Management. Eliza Brennan from the International Community Foundation, which is based here in the San Diego area, manages currently a portfolio of about $3 million focusing on education and educational opportunities for children that are vulnerable in Mexico and Central America, with a hope of giving them more hope and opportunity. She's got a tremendous amount of experience working in the border region, in the San Diego-Tijuana region in particular, and she has a growing portfolio focused on Central America, which today accounted for about $2.25 million for her last fiscal year in terms of grant making. She's got prior development experience, having worked in Nicaragua. Eliza also has a master's degree in public affairs from the LBJ School and at the University of Texas, Austin, and she has a bachelor's in foreign service from Georgetown University. Finally, Richard Ambrose is an accomplished emerging market private equity and venture capital investor. He has over 15 years of experience in this space. He is the co-founder and managing partner of Pomona Impact, an impact investment fund that invest in for-profit businesses with a social mission across Mexico, Central America, Colombia, and Ecuador. Pomona Impact is based in Antigua, Guatemala. Richard is also, he co-founded the Pomona Impact Foundation, which is running a leading ag tech accelerator in Central America. He leads a terrific team of investment professionals that are co-working specialists in Guatemala. He is a graduate of Forum University and an MBA from Georgetown University. At this time, I would like to introduce Paloma Adams-Allen, President and CEO of the Inter-American Foundation, to take on the virtual stage. Paloma?
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Nice to see everyone. Nice to meet you all. Paloma Adams-Allen, head of the IIF. The IIF is actually unique among the organizations represented on this panel because we are not, in fact, a philanthropic organization. We are a US government agency, but we do operate very much like a philanthropic organization in the sense that we're a grant maker. So I will be focusing my remarks today, briefly introducing our development model. Secondly, outlining how we complement the work of other US government agencies. And third, providing a snapshot of our work in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, which will touch on some of the issues you mentioned in your opening, Richard. So very quickly, who are we and how do we work? The IIF is a US development agency created by the US Congress in 1969 and created really, even at that point, to be an alternative to traditional large-scale US government foreign assistance. And we're really charged with localizing development by putting resources for community development, technical and financial resources, directly in the hands of Latin American and Caribbean communities. So that was the reason we were created, and we have really designed all of our systems and processes and our mission to make sure that we're engaging directly with Latin American and Caribbean communities. Our mission is to partner with grassroots organizations and to really surface, support, and scale their approaches and their solutions to local development challenges. All of our work obviously is aligned with the US government's long-term development goals in Latin America and the Caribbean and their goals for global development. We really use a four-pronged strategy in working with communities. First, we provide small grants directly to those communities to catalyze their own projects. We target funding to underserved people, underserved areas, underserved regions. We require broad participation by underrepresented groups or otherwise underserved groups, women, young people, indigenous people, etc. And a big part of our model is fomenting networks of grantee partners. That's really how we help them scale the work that they're doing within a country and across countries. Where do we fit in the US government's toolkit? We really complement the work of the larger agencies. Our niche is focused on the community, working directly with civil society organizations. So we fund projects at a micro scale, but we don't only fund projects, we fund organizations. And a big part of our approach is organizational strengthening. We provide direct investment to local organizations, so we don't use third-party implementers and we don't work with governments. All of our funding goes directly to associations, organizations, etc. Our model is really aimed at ensuring sustainability, especially once we've left a relationship with an organization. And so we do require co-investment from local organizations. And we work with them to identify their resources and to monetize their resources and to ensure that they are part and a partner with us in funding their ideas in their organization. And as I mentioned before, we've really designed our systems to be flexible and as agile as those communities and really small organizations need, so that we can not only work with them on long-term development, but we can work with them in humanitarian crises. So hurricanes, pandemics, economic insecurity, etc. We have ways to adjust our systems to make sure that we're most responsive. So that really covers our model. What are we doing in Central America? And I'll really focus on the Northern Triangle of Central America. Our 100+ grantee partners are really creating alternatives to irregular migration. And their programming does that in two ways. They're really focused on programming that encourages people to stay, not necessarily programming that's exclusively focused on why people might leave. So two buckets of programming. First, these organizations are strengthening civic ties, social ties, economic ties in countries and communities that provide hope and provide paths for people to succeed. And second, they're creating the enabling conditions in their communities to make sure those communities are as resilient as possible to economic shocks, environmental shocks, political shocks, social shocks. And we call those two buckets rootedness and resilience. So those are really the two R's that guide our theory of change in the Northern Triangle. Programmatically, what are they doing? They're increasing economic opportunity through work on entrepreneurship, small business development, et cetera, enhancing disaster and climate resilience, building participation confidence in transparent democratic processes, addressing crime and violence and insecurity, particularly through their work with young people, investing in the ideas and organizations of traditionally marginalized and underserved populations, and they're mobilizing local resources for development, as I said, to really sustain the work that we're doing together. Big picture, beyond complementing US government issues, the IS direct to communities model really has a built-in capability and the flexibility to catalyze community development and economic opportunity in three specific ways. One, because we're small and we're designed to work with communities, we can really take informed risks. And what do I mean by risks? We can work with really incipient organizations. We can work in remote areas in ways that other donors might not be able to do, and particularly maybe large US donors might not be able to do. Second, its core to our model is focusing not simply on a specific project, but strengthening the organizational capacity of those local organizations. So really working with them, not just on their agricultural project necessarily, but also on strengthening their organization, their board, their back office, their auditing, their bank accounts, their finances. All of that is crucial to strengthening their organizations and making them more professional and effective in their roles. And then third, we complement the work projects, organizations with strengthening the broader ecosystem of philanthropy, and basically really focusing on how do you grow and shape community philanthropy in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I will stop there. I've shared our model, some of our work in Central America, and happy to engage further in the Q&A section.
Yeah, thank you, Paloma. And I just want to remind everyone, we have a Q&A button where you can post your questions. We will be posting all presentations from the forum on the Whova platform for those of you that have them. And finally, just want to let you know that we will have we'll have sessions. This session will have presentations of 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Eliza Brennan, Senior Program Officer for the International Community Foundation, who will share perspectives on the state of philanthropy in Central America and the work of the International Community Foundation. Take it away, Eliza. Eliza, you're on mute.
Hello?
Eliza, okay, you're good.
Yeah, I don't know what just happened there.
Okay, you're good. Go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad I was able to. Am I muted?
No, you're good. You're ready to go.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. I think Carlos was going to show my slides. Are you able to do that, Carlos, or should I share screen? I will. Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I just wanted to begin. Whoops, we can put that in presenter view. Otherwise, I can share screen. Thank you. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank Richard, our former president of ICF, and the Institute of the Americas for inviting ICF to be part of this really timely and important conversation. I'm very humbled to be on this panel with distinguished partners and colleagues, including the IAF and the Tinker Foundation. And just to echo what Paloma mentioned, I think there's a lot of overlap in our strategies and our missions as institutions. And so it's really been a pleasure as we've delved deeper in our charitable giving in Central America to have the guidance and partnership of the Inter-American Foundation. So I will begin. We can go to the next slide, Carlos. Just for those who don't know us, giving a quick overview of the International Community Foundation. We are an international nonprofit organization committed to inspiring and facilitating charitable giving from U.S. donors to international causes and organizations, always with the goal of creating healthier, more prosperous, and sustainable communities in Mexico and Latin America. We've been doing this for about 30 years, and our primary mechanism of development is through grant. And so thanks to our donors last year, we granted over 17.4 million to over 250 organizations in 13 countries. And that included nearly 2 million invested in 30 organizations in the Northern Triangle of Central America. Beyond grant making, our goal, similar to IAF, is to strengthen the capacity of local civil society. So we primarily fund grassroots organizations and leaders in the communities where, as Paloma referenced, many other funders may not be able to access. We are very nimble and able to adapt to local contexts. We often fund needs assessments, we fund research, we seek to provide capacity and institutional strengthening workshops, and we often are convening stakeholders in the communities where we work to identify innovative solutions to complex issues. Next slide. Yesterday's speakers highlighted the systemic challenges of corruption and governance in the region, and really underscored the importance that foreign aid be directed to people who need it most, which is primarily done through civil society organizations or maybe independent media. Though there is no definitive, Carlos, if you can go to the next slide, there's no definitive or current data source about total philanthropic dollars being directed to the Northern Triangle. We have seen several data sources, including the Foundation Center, produced a report on data from 2014 and 2015, and the Seattle International Foundation Central America Donor Roundtable Group has been doing an ongoing data collection that shows that there is an upward trend in total philanthropic investments from US foundations to the region. There are a lot of nuances to these numbers, but here you can see that in 2014 and 2015, the Foundation Center's sample of 1,000 large foundations found that over $113 million was distributed to the Northern Triangle. But to put that into context, that in that same time period, about 3.1 billion was distributed by bilateral, multilateral agencies. Similarly, in this current data collection led by Seattle, there's about $50 million being directed to current projects due to end sometime between this year and 2025, but that's only based on data from 9 foundations. And so we can assume that there is, philanthropy is always going to be smaller than the levels of foreign aid to the region, but is definitely trending upward. And philanthropy has important social capital, deep relationships in the region, and really can't go it alone. So anecdotally, I've seen that there's heightened attention to the US southern border where ICF is based. And over the past 4 years, this increased awareness has really sparked interest in the funder community to contribute to the regional approaches that are necessary to protect the lives of people who at this point are being forcibly displaced from Northern Triangle, and improving conditions in their home countries so that they don't have to make that decision to leave and migrate to the northern border. While we're glad to see that there's a renewed commitment from the Biden administration to the region, and particularly to strategies that address systemic corruption and governance challenges, we also know that these long-term objectives will be slow to achieve. And in the meantime, we see that there is opportunity to mitigate some of the immediate push factors for migration from the region by quickly and strategically directing resources to most vulnerable communities, offering people alternatives to embarking on the treacherous migration journey. So this is where ICF found that we could play a unique and critical role, and we believe that philanthropy in general can play a critical role. Given our extensive relationships and experience in the region, foundations and private investors are well positioned to invest in local organizations that can help stabilize and scale existing programs immediately. To be clear, once again, these numbers prove that philanthropy cannot go it alone. But we do have the experience, the social capital, and should be called on to inform and align with regional strategies by other government, multilateral, and private stakeholders. Next slide, please. So this has been ICF's approach to our grant making strategy in Central America. but also in most communities where we work, which, as I mentioned, are primarily in Mexico. As the go-to international funder at the US-Mexico border, we and our donors know what happens in Central America has immediate and direct impacts on border communities. And so although a few years ago when we were approached by several donors about contributing to the regional approaches in Central America, we knew our funding would never be sufficient to address the complex systemic issues at the root of this issue, of the migration trend. However, we identified 3 ways that we could provide immediate and strategic contributions. One was investing in current initiatives that seek to address the push factors of forced displacement, such as climate change, food insecurity, or lack of educational employment opportunities. This includes responding to immediate needs following disasters such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the hurricanes Eta and Iota, which hit the region at the end of last year. As a result of our funding, 2,000 families in Guatemala have received direct food assistance within 2 weeks of the pandemic, which really helped them to get through the toughest months of the pandemic and the seasonal drought. Unlike government actors, private philanthropy is able to be nimble and flexible in these situations, which leads to the second prong of our strategy, where we can provide stability and bridge gaps during moments of political uncertainty or financial uncertainty in the region. Several of ICF's grantees were receiving bridge funding from us to help them get through and continue multi-year US government funded initiatives where their funding was either uncertain or had been slashed under the previous administration. This not only allowed them to maintain their programs, but also allowed them to retain highly trained staff, just keep their lights on, make sure that resources that had already been invested in for several years were not going to waste during this period of uncertainty. And also has allowed several of these grantees to leverage new funding from new donors or private investors. Beyond the direct impacts of these programs, which are many, there were 30 grantees in this past year, but just to throw out some numbers, we had 1,000 youth who were able to complete 5-year entrepreneurship trainings, or we were able to help 400 farmers continue to diversify and get their organic products such as eggs, chickpeas, and avocados to market. All of these programs wouldn't have been possible without bridge funding from rapidly responding foundations. Meanwhile, even though we might have smaller financial resources, the show of solidarity and investment in civil society and our ability to be responsive and flexible offsets one of the major pitfalls, I believe, of the bilateral foreign assistance model. Third, ICF's grant making prioritizes developing local leadership. So as was discussed yesterday, we know that a robust civil society and private sector is key to achieving democratic good governance, which is a long-term goal for the region. Whether we're investing in locally led organizations through general operations grants that cover staff salaries or investing in people and their professional development, we know that these investments will have long-term implications for the region. For example, in 2020, through the Transforming Market Systems program in Honduras, ICF was granting loans to 3 regional chambers of commerce, which benefited 160 small and medium enterprises who then were able to use that money flexibly to respond to new needs in their business model and adjust their business model to the pandemic conditions, and thereby creating thousands of local jobs in their communities. So again, philanthropy is contributing to long-term regional objective of promoting greater prosperity in Central America while also responding nimbly. This leads me to my final point. I think I'm getting close to time here. The next slide, Carlos, please. Is just a sort of reiteration of what I've mentioned, but also recommendations and opportunities for philanthropy based on ICF's experience and our lessons learned from partnerships with other funders such as IEF, Tinker, and the Seattle International Foundation, not to mention our grantee partners who are the true experts in the region. I'd like to offer 4 recommendations that I think segue well into the presentations that my colleagues will be leading. First, in a region that's facing extreme uncertainty and highly influenced by politicized foreign assistance, philanthropy is uniquely positioned to be responsive and flexible. As I mentioned, COVID and the hurricanes were just two examples of how important it was to have flexible and untethered funding. Second, investing in local capacity is critical to long-term stability, sustainability, and resilience, particularly in present circumstances where we are seeing civil society in the region under attack from local governments and the political elite, as was discussed extensively yesterday. Also, investing locally refers to investing in education and this extremely young demographic who are eager to develop their skills and find jobs in their home countries. I know that Caroline will elaborate on these opportunities in her presentation about Tinker Foundation's grant making. Third, as I said previously, we can't go it alone. Philanthropy has to meet immediate needs. We can fill gaps, we can test and invest, and we can bring hope to the thousands of hopeless individuals who are currently fleeing the region. I think Eric Olson framed it very well yesterday when he described how hopelessness is really one of the motivating factors for families and young people leaving the region, and that's an immediate area where philanthropy can help mitigate the forcible displacement that we're seeing. But of course, these efforts should always align with regional strategies, and ICF is committed to continuing our grant making in accordance with what we're seeing come from the Biden administration and our colleagues in the philanthropic field. Finally, philanthropy is in a unique position where we can raise awareness and leverage new resources from our colleagues in the field, from the private sector. And I think it's important that we continue to work with local foundations and local private sector in Central America to really inspire them to act and respond in the ways that we've seen US philanthropy respond for decades. Likewise, there are several innovative financial models like impact investments, which Richard will speak to shortly, all of which philanthropy can help to implement in the region. So I will leave it at that, but I look forward to questions and further discussion.
Eliza, thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Carleen Kronley, President of the Tinker Foundation. We'll talk about their work in the Northern Triangle region. Carleen?
Thank you, Richard, and it is such a pleasure to be here with many close allies and partners of Tinker, and also some new faces. Richard, I'm really looking forward to hearing your work on impact investing in the region. I'd like to share a couple of thoughts about Tinker's experience working in Central America. Like IAF, we're a foundation focused on the entire Latin American and Caribbean region, but certainly Central America, and in particular the Northern Triangle, is a key geography for our work, and a place where we find a lot of really promising opportunities to support civil society organizations working on the issues of greatest importance for communities in the region. So I will share just a couple of slides that I hope help bring to life this work and what we've seen around the kind of role that philanthropy can play. I think one overarching point I wanted to make in this presentation that I think Paloma and Eliza have already teed up so well is that, I think foundations recognize that they occupy one place on a kind of continuum of capital that's necessary to support development. We have certain resources at our disposal, certain characteristics that can make us effective, but we are most impactful when partnered closely with not only civil society, but also other forms of funding. So I'll share kind of two quick examples of how I think philanthropy can be really effective in the region, just trying to animate those with examples from the kinds of things that we're supporting at Tinker. And then as Richard said, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about education in particular. I find that particularly given the impact of the pandemic on education, it's an issue of tremendous near-term and long-term importance to the region that doesn't always get as much attention as I think at least is merited in these kinds of discussions about development in the Northern Triangle. So I want to use some of my time to make a case for a shared focus on that issue among the many other priorities in the region moving forward. So one way that I think philanthropic funding, even fairly modest philanthropic funding, can be really powerful is helping to test new models for community change and ultimately for systems change. So very briefly, I'd mention as an example, the Women's Justice Initiative, a grantee of ours based in Patsun, Guatemala, that has an innovative model for supporting community advocates in Indigenous communities, women who are identified who can really be champions in terms of access to justice for other women in their community, whether those issues that they might be facing include gender-based violence, issues around land rights, early marriage, etc. And what's really powerful about the model is that these community advocates, who again are from these Indigenous communities, can not only be a resource and an advocate for fellow women, but also a resource for public officials, right? So whether that's mayors, other local leaders, prosecutors, police, who are perhaps not fully supported to play an appropriate role in addressing these kinds of issues from where they sit within institutions. And so, specifically, Tinker is working with the Women's Justice Initiative to take a model that's been really successful in one context around training these community advocates and test how it could be adapted, streamlined, and ultimately scaled to other contexts as well, and confirming whether that impact indeed holds. So that's sort of a great example for me of how philanthropic funding can really build on a successful base of evidence and make sure that a model is primed for far greater scale. And I would just also want to say that I think the issue of gender-based violence is an important one as we think about larger issues of impunity in the region or reasons for migration. We often talk about impunity in the context of sort of grand corruption, but there's also a very important and acute kind of impunity that takes place when women and children and other vulnerable people are not able to access justice when they are victims of crime, even in the most intimate settings, right? And so part of what organizations like Women's Justice Initiative do is show to communities and to individuals that public institutions can in fact work on their behalf. And I think that is a really important complement to more top-down efforts to promote rule of law or to address impunity in the region. Next, I wanted to highlight something that I think both Eliza and Paloma talked about, which is the potential for philanthropic funding to support the investment in local leadership capacity and resilience. And I won't spend as much time on this example, but Tinker is supporting a group of fisher cooperatives in the Atlantic coast of Honduras who have been absolutely battered by both COVID and the hurricanes, to really think about not just how to rebuild in the near term, but how they can build their leadership capability, how they can build networks around sort of ongoing and expanding access to markets, maintaining sustainable practices that will enable them to benefit from marine resources in the long term, and really as a group, as a collective, have the capacity to not just respond to current challenges, but anticipate and address future ones. And so a sort of shorter term investment in that kind of capacity building, I think, can pay off in the much longer term, and very much reinforces the sort of phrase that Paloma shared before around how can we support both rootedness in local communities, in local economies, and also resilience in a region that, unfortunately is disproportionately subject to both human-made and natural disasters that can really set back development very profoundly and suddenly. So finally, I wanted to talk a bit about education as I think a critical area where all kinds of different funding can really come together in complementary ways to address what is a growing issue. And just to sort of set the stage for this, this photo to me embodies both the opportunity and in some ways the challenge. So this is a photo that went viral in El Salvador last year. And what it depicts is a young man outside of his house trying to get enough cell phone signal to be able to submit his schoolwork during school closures, which have continued in most of the countries of the region and for most students. And we, on the one hand, see his sort of resourcefulness, and as Eliza was saying, his sort of commitment to learning and education as a path forward for himself and his family, and also the ways in which, the utter disruption of access to education from the pandemic, put people in really challenging positions, disconnected them from hard-won learning opportunities, and frankly, I think in many cases, valiant efforts of ministries of education to try to patch together responses, remote learning, et cetera, are quite challenging in places where, so few people have reliable connectivity and access to devices. And so today, as things stand, we are now in the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle looking at a second school year that is marked by widespread school closures, most students remain out of school with not a lot of encouraging signs that that will change anytime soon. And because of connectivity issues and other challenges, that means for the most part that learning is, for all intents and purposes, quite profoundly affected. So let's talk a little bit about just why that matters so much. Really, I mean, part of what makes this such a sort of tragic reversal due to the pandemic is that the region had actually been making some pretty important progress, particularly in terms in recent decades of growing access to primary education, increasingly access to secondary education, incremental improvements in terms of quality of education. There's certainly a long way to go. In just 1 or 2 years of the pandemic, researchers are suggesting that for the most vulnerable students, we're going to go back to 1960s era secondary school completion rates. So basically, in a year or two, we've lost 6 decades of progress. And that's progress that was fought for by governments themselves, by international donors, and by the sacrifices of individual families, parents, giving everything they could to give their children a better chance through education. So we're seeing that slip away. And I think that is a tragedy on a scale that we're not sort of fully addressing as a philanthropic community today. Certainly that has implications beyond education. So the World Bank, for example, looking at all of Latin America and the Caribbean, is projecting up to 1.7 trillion in foregone lifetime earnings due to earnings due to learning loss. And just to put that in perspective, it's about 10% of what we might expect the population might earn. So really this is setting back individuals, families, and economies, and those effects, that scarring, will only intensify if schools remain closed. Of course, we see a particular impact in rural areas for low-income families and girls, which is cause for particular concern. And I think it's important to note too that schools being closed doesn't just affect learning or future economic opportunities. It's also really important because schools tend to be a locus of safety and protection and services in the region. It's perhaps a place where many students are able to get their most reliable, nutritious meal of the day. It's a place where they're relatively protected from violence, whether in the home or in their communities. And so, while there's not great evidence being generated on this yet, I think we can expect to see growing likelihood, growing exposure to criminal recruitment, to pressures for irregular migration among young people, simply because the alternative of education is right now not available to them. So certainly, getting schools back open is hugely necessary, but it's also not sufficient. So, we know that students will be returning to schools when that eventually happens with both, tremendous learning losses at a real disadvantage in terms of their learning, and then also potentially with pretty significant trauma given what they may have lived through in the last year or so. So quite important that schools and teachers in particular have the resources to be able to welcome students with open arms and really make sure they not only come to school but stay in school, thrive in school, and see school as a path forward for their own lives and careers and for their communities. Well, that's perhaps a pretty bleak picture. I want to end with a bit of a call to action, because I actually think that there's an enormous amount that the different funding sectors represented on this panel can do to move the needle on this issue. And so I want to kind of talk through one by one. But for me, this is really an area where coming together, we could accomplish a tremendous amount. And of course, in partnership with national governments and with local civil society. So first, philanthropy, my sector, what should we be doing to address the impact of the pandemic on education? Certainly I talked before about the value of testing new models and generating evidence of what works. For the past year plus, this is exactly what Tinker and other funders have been doing, supporting organizations that are figuring out how to keep kids connected to learning despite, these enormous obstacles. I think philanthropy has a special obligation to focus on the most vulnerable and those that are hardest for the state to reach. And that's baked into certainly how IAF and ICF work as well. And then finally, I think, if there's a silver lining that some of us as parents, might identify with who have had kids at home trying to learn over the past year, it's that the pandemic has forced parents to be more sort of aware of and engaged in their children's learning. So what are the opportunities that philanthropy and civil society could help cultivate to create spaces where parents and communities can be more active participants in education, really demanding education that's high quality, that's relevant for their children's futures. So a number of things that philanthropy can do and that frankly don't require such enormous resources really to get the ball rolling. In terms of direct foreign assistance, I mean, I think there's tremendous opportunities because of the scale of resources involved and also the access, right, to governments who are key to any kind of massive rollout of efforts to reach students and families and teachers. So certainly I would love to see support to ministries of education for safe reopening. And frankly, I think there are ways to do that with accountability and transparency if designed well. And on the other hand, I think DFA can play an important role in helping to scale up some of those proven civil society interventions that I referenced before, really bringing them to a population level, whether that's teacher training, intensive tutoring to help kids get back on track, new interventions to address social emotional needs, et cetera. And then finally, I'd call out the importance of vaccines. I think there were some exciting announcements about this just earlier today. I think as the US makes its vaccines available to the rest of the hemisphere and the rest of the world, I would love to see those partner countries, the receiving countries, placing teachers and other school staff among other essential workers that are at the front of the line for receiving vaccines. Because until teachers feel confident going back to school, there will be sort of major barriers to getting schools reopened. And consequently, I think these learning disruptions will continue and families will not be able to sort of fully resume their own participation in the economy and so forth. And then finally, impact investing. I think we've seen this really exciting profusion of new ed tech models during the pandemic and an awareness of the way that technology, when deployed well, can really be effective in educational settings. So that feels like a really investable opportunity for impact investors. And then also, I think worth exploring whether there are blended finance models, bridge financing models that could also support this safe reopening agenda that will be so critical for the region's children. So, again, I think if you imagine all of these things happening together with civil society, with national governments, you can start to imagine an educational recovery that doesn't just get kids back in school, but actually really begins to sort of transform the trajectory of education in the Northern Triangle. So I'll stop there, but thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this topic that we're so passionate about, and I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody else.
Caroline, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And that last slide, I think, was a good segue for our next panelist, Richard Ambrose, who is the managing director and co-founder of Pomona Impact Fund. As I mentioned, and as also Caroline alluded to, impact investing is an area of new opportunity. In recent years, we've seen a growth in green and social bonds that are coming into the market. There's a growing number of impact investors that are looking for a social bottom line, in addition to a monetary bottom line. And additionally, a number of foundations are beginning to add impact investing as an asset class in their endowment portfolios. So this is an exciting new area. I think there's great synergies with philanthropy. And at this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Richard Ambrose. So Richard, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Richard. And it's a privilege to share the stage with you all. Caroline, Paloma, Eliza, it's great to be here. Well, just really briefly, I'll describe what Pomona is, what we're doing. Our goal is effectively to unlock access to capital in highly dynamic, small growing businesses across Central America, in agriculture, basic services, and the digital economy, with the goal of helping them to profitably scale their impact. And so we really go about this in two ways. First, we have a direct investment arm. We launched a small pilot fund a couple of years ago, deployed it in 20 companies, really across the region and throughout a wide variety of sectors, and even utilizing a wide variety of instruments. And really this pilot was kind of a proof of concept and a great learning opportunity that also yielded some compelling results. So based off that learning, we've actually been able to leverage that learning to inform our thesis of the new investment fund that we've just recently launched, a $30 million impact investing fund targeting agriculture, basic services, and the digital economy once again for Central America, and really to scale our investing activities. We see the opportunities, and we're excited to be able to respond to them. And what we really want to do is usher in this philosophy of impact investing to the region, as there's still not a lot of active players at this point. The other aspect to Pomona Impact is the Pomona Impact Foundation. We, under the foundation, we really push two things. And one is, originally it was to drive more community building among entrepreneurs. I've worked in a co-working space, and I've seen the benefits of being able to tap the person to your right or to your left to solve quick problems. And this is actually in the US, where there are a lot more resources. As a result, we thought it was very important to launch co-working spaces in the region and effectively help develop these communities. So originally we launched 2 of our own. We worked with several other teams in other countries in the region, and as a result have been able to support the growth of these co-working spaces and communities in the region. The other aspects really on the programmatic front, we run a variety of acceleration incubation programs, capacity trainings. It's largely for entrepreneurs to prepare to engage investors. We're helping them build out their data rooms, their financial projections, and then connecting them with prospective investors to help get them funded and scale their growth. And so it's really the investment arm and the foundation arm work in tandem, oftentimes serving each other. But another key piece is in the partnership side as well, which I'll touch on. Kind of a few things that have been exciting for us in the last 5 years, deploying some of this capital, and some of the key learnings was just having a high degree of flexibility. We didn't want to get sector specific. We're not even country specific. We have to have a high degree of flexibility around the structures that we use, the sectors, and really it's largely in order to be able to work with the best. We want to work with the strongest entrepreneurs that are really prepared to engage to scale their businesses and their impact. Secondly, on the structuring side, we can do traditional venture capital. We can do things that look more like pure debt, and everything in between, mezzanine, venture debt, and so on. And so the idea is to be able to apply the right instrument to a company that's in a specific stage, and that also responds to the state of the current capital markets. There's not a lot of exit opportunities in Central America still, and as a result, you want to work largely with more self-liquidating instruments. And then one of the third big takeaways, I think that's very exciting, and a big reason why I'm excited to participate on this panel is just leveraging partnerships. I definitely come more from the private sector investing side of things. I didn't have too much familiarity with the foundations and NGOs doing all these terrific work. And Pomona has really been able to benefit from a lot of the relationships developed with large international foundations, NGOs doing great work in the region. And I think, as Caroline mentioned, in some cases, NGOs are funding these pilots to get these business models proven, at which point it's a great opportunity to have investment capital there to then begin to work with a company and scale it. And so we really celebrate our relationships with all the partnerships in the region that we've been able to establish and hope to continue to grow it. I think one specific case, and I like to use this just to highlight the power of impact-driven businesses. And this is the reason why I personally left a career in finance in the US to start Pomona, because I've seen firsthand the benefits of companies that are able to leverage the power of commerce to drive systemic change. And so one of our portfolio companies is called Ecofiltro. It's a great company producing low-cost water filters and based here in Guatemala. And they have a for-profit model, but it's very much an impact-driven business. And in the 10 years, almost 10 years of their existence, they now have over 450,000 water filters dispersed around rural communities in Guatemala. And these are filters that were bought by the individual families, and I use it to highlight the work that they've done in a sustainable manner at this point. Is probably done more to address the problem of access to potable water than maybe even national governmental support in Guatemala. This is a commercial approach to address this challenge around access to potable water. And so it's looking at examples like that have us excited to continue to find these dynamic entrepreneurs, creating models that are both doing very good and doing it profitably or sustainably. And now maybe just a quick comment on the state of the impact investing industry in Central America. I think something very exciting, and it's great to see we're seeing a lot more participation from some of the foundations creating an impact investing arm. And we're seeing a few other I would say small funds begin to look a little bit more closely at Central America. I think the region does offer opportunities. There's big opportunity in agriculture to extend the local value chain, and oftentimes it's in the processing where you find a lot of the margins in these agricultural oriented businesses. So there's interesting opportunity in the agro-processing space. And then as technology gets cheaper and cheaper, you're seeing a lot of companies emerge that are offering superior services in the health and education and financial space that are prepared to take on investment capital to scale their growth and ultimately provide a superior service at oftentimes a lower cost than what is available through kind of traditional channels. And so it's an exciting time, I think, to be doing what we're doing, and we hope to continue to be able to work closely with a number of you out there. So if you're interested to learn more about Pomona Impact, I'd be happy to answer questions directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. At this time, we've got an opportunity for some questions. We've got about a half hour before we conclude our session. I want to start out with a few questions, and then we can also then get questions from the audience. First, this is a question for all of you. In the work that you do, both on the philanthropic side and on the impact investment side, obviously you're working in an environment where there's also direct foreign assistance coming in. Vice President Harris is going to be in Guatemala next week and has already made some announcements about commitments to the civil society and NGOs, shifting away from support from direct government assistance to civil society. In light of that fact, how can your organizations move the needle? How can you complement the administration's efforts on the ground in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador? So I welcome thoughts from each of you. Paloma, you want to take a stab at it?
Sure, I'll start because we operate in this nexus of government and operationally like philanthropy, but we are in fact a part of the federal response. Obviously, we are thrilled that the new administration is focusing so heavily on work with civil society, work directly with communities, and really we believe and we know ICF and Tinker well enough as partners now and in the past that the community really is a unit of change, right? So for us, it's not doing something different necessarily. It's really trying to expand what we're doing. And, as the government representative here, or the federal representative here, I would say one of the things that we'd look to philanthropy for, and we've actually partnered with ICF, for instance, specifically in these areas, is to fill some of the gaps that we as federal government, even though we are as nimble as possible for a federal government agency, even though we are direct communities as possible, even though we're as responsive as possible, we're still a federal government agency, and there's some limitations just being part of a large bureaucracy. And so the flexibility that philanthropy has in terms of the funding that it has, that is multi-year, the flexibility being small and nimble, the ability to sort of buy down the risk, whether it be for the impact investment space or even for federal government. And when I say buy down the risk, I'm thinking about helping feed a pipeline of effective civil society organizations. We can only fund so many grassroots organizations. Those take a long time. They're tiny, they're hard to work with in the sense that they need a lot of investment. And when you're using 1 year or 2 year funding as a government entity, you can't exclusively have grassroots organizations as your only partners, right? And so having entities like ICF and like Tinker working also directly with those organizations and getting them to a stage that they can partner with IAF or other larger agencies is really crucial. And so what we see really is there may potentially be a lot of funding going into Central America looking to partner with civil society, but there are only so many civil society organizations that currently exist, and or so many that could really partner in a robust way with large government entities. And so I think philanthropy has a crucial role to play in terms of building up that early pipeline of organizations. So that would be my first sort of pitch. And the second is, as we're thinking about sustainable development in the Northern Triangle in particular, one of the things we have been focusing on, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is this area of community philanthropy. And that is, it's really one of our approaches, and this is something we are doing with some other philanthropic partners. Mott Foundation is one, and they've been a longtime partner with us in this space. But really, how do we shift the narrative around philanthropy in the region? So we're all external, but how do we shift the narrative about philanthropy coming out of the region, in particular the role of communities, the role of average people, the role of small businesses, the role of microenterprises. And one of the things that we do is we fund small community foundations, right, that are, think of them as a small Tinker, ICF, or IAF based in communities or based in a specific geographic area. And the people of those communities contribute, donate their money to this foundation, as well as larger funders, of course, but they also have a role in designing the projects and the initiatives that these foundations work on. So thinking about how we not only respond, but how do we grow the field of community philanthropy in the Northern Triangle, because we're going to need that ecosystem to sustain us. And then third, absolutely, Richard, I'm thinking of our portfolio of 330 plus grants and organizations, and at least half of them are sort of productive enterprises. And we at the IF, in fact, we did our first impact investment. We're a learning organization. We're supposed to test new models, and we have done our first impact investment in Costa Rica with a former grantee. Obviously knew them very well. They knew us. There was a trust, and we are seeing how that goes. But thinking through that, we would love to have a better pipeline of potential impact investors who could work with organizations, particularly community enterprises like the ones we work with, because we and or Tinker or ICF have sort of invested in getting them to a point where really they should move on to a more commercial relationship, and we should pivot to smaller organizations. So these are all the things that we tackle, and we know we're doing them pretty well, but philanthropy really has more flexibility and brings additionality that we don't necessarily have as a US government entity.
Thank you, Paloma. Carleen, what are some of your thoughts from the Tinker's perspective?
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't agree more with what Paloma already shared. And I guess I'd maybe emphasize a point I made earlier about the role that philanthropy can play, testing models and also generating an evidence base that makes it sort of feasible for direct foreign assistance to be mobilized at a large scale, because there's greater confidence in the potential for impact. And so I try to loosely keep track, of Tinker grants that get picked up for much larger scale funding of this type. I think just thinking about maybe 3 grants in the last year, they were able to, that Tinker initially funded for this kind of experimentation, research, evidence generation purposes, they were able to mobilize more GFA funding than Tinker made in grants in the entire year, right? So I mean, for us, that's an enormous success story, being able to support an organization to leverage those kinds of resources. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then I would just say, I think a place where we just need to work together, and Eliza alluded to this, and I really appreciate the leadership I've seen coming out of USAID, for example, recently on this as well, is defending civil society, which is so under threat right now. And both private foundations and government donors can together play a really important role in standing up for organizations that are, at times threatened because of their effectiveness and because of their independence. And so, I think continued coordination and commitment to a vibrant, civil society being part of the future of this region and its development will be really important going forward.
Thank you, Caroline. Eliza, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with everything Paloma and Caroline have mentioned. I think that, philanthropy, on the last point that Caroline just made, I think philanthropy isn't necessarily playing the advocacy role in Central America that we could. I really commend the Seattle International Foundation for their leadership in that space. And I think it's a space that ICF and others as civil society is continually being oppressed by new laws and just individual human rights defenders in particular are certainly being threatened. I think it's a place that we have some independence that federal and foreign investment doesn't necessarily. Likewise, the community foundation model that Paloma mentioned is thanks to the support of Mott Foundation and IAF and others, and we're direct partners of several of these community foundations in Mexico. I don't think is fully established yet in Central America, and I think there's a lot of potential for centering community-driven solutions in our direct foreign investment approach, and it's something that I think, again, I'm refreshed and really grateful to see that the Biden administration so far is actively reaching out to civil society, actively reaching out to the philanthropic community to inform those strategies. And I hope that this community-driven model is taken into account in their approach. And finally, I think, again, everyone sort of touched on this, but scaling models and providing the seed funding and testing pilots. Just a couple of examples from ICF's grant making experience. There's a new local affiliate of Teach for All, similar to Teach for America in Guatemala, called Teach for Guatemala, Enseña por Guatemala. And they're not a locally established nonprofit, but ICF has been able to fund them because we have some flexibility with how we can deploy our dollars. We've been able to fund their fledgling board and help them hire a local staff person to really go through that process of the needs assessment and building relationships with the Ministry of Education and establishing, it's a very tedious process to become an established nonprofit in many of these countries. So giving them that seed capital so that they can then, we know that they have a proven model. It's been proven in Mexico and several other countries in Latin America, that they can then directly impact the quality of education. Likewise, Tinker, I think, was one of the first funders of the SAT program, Sistema Aprendizaje Tutorial, which is a rural employability education program that Fabreto Children's Foundation in Nicaragua operates, as well as Bayan, Asociación Bayan in Honduras. Asociación Bayan's model is now being funded by the Honduran Ministry of Education, and that was thanks to initial investments from funders like Tinker. And so I think there's just a lot of potential for us to co-finance and complement the work that our federal dollars is going towards.
Well, thank you, Richard. Some thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I would echo many of the same comments. I think I think one of the interesting things that, and just specifically speaking about USAID and even some of the more current conversations with the new administration, that's interesting for us is there's interest in supporting some of the activities that we're doing around investing, as well as supporting some of the capacity training programs that we have to help train local investors to get more involved in what are fair terms and how do you engage a small company and structure an investment. And so, so I think it's been very exciting to see, that line of interest, but also through USAID and through some of these initiatives coming out of it, it's actually very much encouraging us to work more closely with the foundations that are doing some of the early work, which is so important to create and fortify this ecosystem. So so I just kind of highlight that role in that in our case, we see in the way USAID is supporting some of our activities, they also bring us into the circle of other players that we might have been maybe a little slower to connect with, but have been able to connect with as a result of some of these relationships put together by the government and USAID.
Thank you, Richard. I want to mention that following this session, the Institute of Americas will be publishing a list of key foundations, public foundations that are committed in the Northern Triangle region. In addition to IAF, to the International Community Foundation, to Tinker, the Seattle Foundation is a real leader in this space. They have an annual Central American Donor Forum that I've had a chance to attend several years. They have brought the community together of funders committed to Central America. Avena Foundation is another organization very committed, Hispanics in Philanthropy. A number of US community foundations are beginning to get engaged, largely because there's a large diaspora of Central Americans now living in the United States. The California Community Foundation in LA is one of those that has begun investing in Central America. So again, we will post those, we will provide information to those of you interested. It'll be on the Whova platform. I also want to mention that on the Whova platform, we have put a report that was edited by Eric Olson. Eric Olson was one of our panelists yesterday. He published an excellent report entitled U.S. Foreign Aid to the Northern Triangle 2014 to 2019. I encourage you all to read it. It's very enlightening. I think it helps to shed some of the limitations of the model of direct foreign assistance in the past. In that report, he highlighted the fact that only 40% of foreign assistance was going for development assistance. There was other money going for military support, for economic aid, and not necessarily having all that money go to communities on the ground, which is really where I think philanthropy has come in and filled the gap. So I encourage you to all see that report. As a next follow-up question, Caroline spoke about COVID and vaccines. Wanted to get your thoughts about the role that U.S. corporate philanthropy can play internationally through in-kind investment. If you look at the universe of corporate giving, the vast majority of corporate giving is in kind, and the pharmaceutical companies in the United States have been real leaders in in-kind giving of medicine, and including vaccines. So I would like to get your thoughts on what role IAF can play, the Council of Foundations can play in nudging U.S. corporate leaders, in particular Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, to engage their philanthropic arms to amp up the vaccine assistance to the Northern Triangle. So I'd love to get some thoughts on that point.
Given that we're in the federal government, we generally would defer, obviously, to the CDC and other parts of government to be managing, along with WHO, et cetera, or PAHO, a vaccine effort in Latin America and the Caribbean. I will say that if we get to a point, and the strategy and the mandate of the government is that we need in the community deployment of vaccines, of course, IF would be involved in that discussion, but we are not in any place, in general, we don't work in the area of health just because that's not what grantees are asking for. We have, I will say, provided a lot of support last year and this year to help communities address COVID, preventative side, economic recovery, counseling, gender-based violence, access to education, as Caroline was speaking about, but we have not engaged in the vaccine space, partly because that's a conversation that needs to happen. Yeah. Whole of government, so we're not in a position to respond specifically to that question, but obviously positioned to work with communities as called upon.
Caroline, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, you're a leader in the philanthropic space, and know many of your peers in the corporate philanthropic community.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak maybe less specifically to vaccines and more to another incredible asset that multinational companies have, which is their employees. So here in the US, volunteerism is a big part of corporate philanthropy culture. And we're starting to see really encouraging signs of that in Central America as well. One organization that's, I think, a common grantee for us on the panel, Glasswing International, has engaged thousands of volunteers as tutors, for example, to support children in its programs over the last number of years. And that's a kind of intervention that would be enormously helpful right now as we're trying to deal with this, learning gap, and that can, there's all kinds of models for virtual tutoring as well that doesn't even require people to leave the comfort of their home or office, but can really make an enormous difference for kids getting ready to go back to school. So I guess I just encourage corporations to be creative about the range of ways to deploy their people as well as their products to solve some of the most pressing issues facing the region.
Thank you, Karen. Eliza, you have any thoughts?
I mean, I think this is something internally at ICF we've talked about. I don't have any knowledge of corporate philanthropy engaging in vaccine distribution. I think it seems that in Central America in particular, it seems the challenge is the supply. I have spoken with someone from UNICEF who shared with me that UNICEF has been leading a global effort to advocate to pharmaceutical companies to at least donate back or negotiate the prices of vaccines on behalf of countries, and with the goal of reaching at least all of the children, school-age children, and teachers in every country. And so they have this very interactive dashboard online, just kind of real time, and they are providing logistical support, including cold storage and the full transportation process to get the vaccines to countries in Latin America. But the last I looked at that about a month ago, Central America had something in the low thousands secured, whereas Brazil and Mexico and other countries had more significant numbers. So I think there's an opportunity perhaps for corporate funders to join that effort. But yeah, I haven't heard of anything myself.
We have time just one more question I wanted to put out, and then we're going to conclude our session. We've got another session with our congressional delegation in a bit, and that has to do with the challenges that civil society faces now in the Northern Triangle. In our session yesterday, focusing on rule of law, security, and governance, we heard from Eric and Adriana and our other panelists about the challenges civil society organizations are facing from governments that are beginning to strong arm them to put, and potentially in case of Guatemala, legislation that would prohibit them from becoming vocal advocates on government policies. We're beginning to see similar overtures by the AMLO administration in Mexico. As foundations, what role do you think you can play in helping to counteract some of these moves, recognizing the fact that one of the concerns that some of these governments have is that these organizations themselves are receiving philanthropic support from foreign entities, and in particular from the United States. So I'd love to get some of your thoughts on this point. Are there any way you want to comment?
I can go. So I'm participating in the Seattle International Foundation Central America Donors roundtables that they've been hosting, and under the leadership of Eric Olson. And at a recent, this has definitely been a topic of conversation amongst that group. And at a recent meeting, there was discussion of an idea put forth by the Ford Foundation, actually, and Rockefeller Brothers Foundation to support, to embed funding within all of our grants to the region that will essentially give these organizations, and particularly ones that are being vocal and taking on a role of defending human rights, provide them the flexibility to either help their staff in the situation where they're being oppressed, or to in worst case scenario, fund their exile. This is just an idea I think that's being floated, but I found it very compelling, and also I think concerning that it's only US funded foundations at the moment that are sort of under attack. And so I think that there's also, if we're going to go that route of funding people to defend them, we also need to be more proactive about advocating and using our position in philanthropy to defend them before it gets to that level. And in, I think there's a lot of trepidation on the part of philanthropy to take on advocacy roles for obvious reasons, but I think there's also, we hold a lot of collective power, and I think it's important that we use our position to defend these people before these laws get enacted.
Thank you, Eliza. Any additional thoughts from the other panelists?
I mean, I would just add that I think this is always something that's important, but the current climate makes it that much more important that we as foundations operate with as much transparency as we possibly can, and as much clarity about what we fund and why, and what we don't fund and why, so that hopefully our own practices never become a liability for the organizations that we're seeking to support. And so I know that for Tinker has been a consideration as we've thought about things as sort of mundane as what information we publish on our website, right? Trying to have a bias toward being really clear about who we are and what we do and why.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I will just add on to Caroline's point that that's one of the things. It's always, again, we're government. So our government is obviously standing up with civil society in several countries. But not in the Northern Triangle necessarily, but in Colombia, for instance, and other countries, we really are having to think through with our grantees. And these are not, we don't fund advocacy necessarily. These are organizations who are working on biodiversity, or they're working on whatever their local issues are, but they are posing a threat to organized crime and others, and really having to think through how to help protect them in those settings, as in this case, they are organizations receiving US government funding. So, I think one of the things we think through, and we take our lead from them, is we don't want to say or do anything that would put you in greater jeopardy. So we're very thoughtful about what we say publicly, not that you can't find anything you need to find as they're funded with US taxpayer dollar on our website, but, not necessarily making them a lightning rod with our sort of comms campaign, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that, take the lead from those organizations. I do think this is an important role for philanthropy, however, because a lot of the grantees we all fund are holistic, right? They are working on productive enterprises, working on education, and they're working potentially on women's rights or some other issue that could get them in the crossfire of local officials. And so I do think that it's really helpful to have a common approach, and to really first prioritize the safety and security of the grantee organizations.
Thank you, Paloma. With that, I think we're going to have to call it a day. Paloma, Caroline, Eliza, Richard, thank you so much for your participation on this panel. I want to remind all participants that all our sessions are being recorded. They'll be available on the Whova platform, as well as the other resources that we're posting. Thank you all for participating, and I look forward to your attendance in our final session with Congressman Vargas and Congressman Peter, representing the San Diego border region, to talk about their perspectives on the impact of migration, as well as the economic opportunity and security challenges for the Northern Triangle. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in future Institute of the Americas programs. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.